Hello and welcome to the Live Better series, and in today's presentation we're in our second presentation as part of a three-part series where we're taking a look at acceptance and commitment therapy with depression. So specifically today we're going to be talking about depression. What is depression? We're going to be taking a look at maybe a different perspective on depression. We're going to also be talking about how to use acceptance and commitment therapy to address depression. Now, let me revisit a couple of themes that we talked about last week that I think are really important as we move forward today. And of course, Dr. Pavlatos and I, we want to give credit to Dr. Strassel and Dr. Robinson, the authors of this really good workbook, which you might want to get if you can't watch all of our presentations. You might want to get this workbook, the Mindfulness and Acceptance Workbook for Depression. Really good workbook, and it is a workbook. You don't just read it, it's really a workbook that you can use. So a really important theme that we talked about last week was this question about if you stopped struggling with your depression, how would your life be better? The real answer, first of all, is to stop the tug of war, to drop the rope, and to stop struggling with our depression. And then, following up with our decision to stop struggling with it, the next thing we ask ourselves is, what's important to me? What are my values and what's important to me? So that is the way out of this struggling with depression, or this trap of depression. Let me talk with you for a few minutes about this trap that we get into with depression. So, because we are human, we all have bad things. We all have painful things happen to us. Someone close to us dies. We are rejected. We are abandoned. We fail at something. We have a chronic physical illness. A friend, a lover has a chronic illness. They're losing part of their life, part of their functioning. These really painful things happen to us. Now, when we're being present in our life, we feel the feelings. And we have those thoughts of what it's like to go through those experiences. However, if we don't feel like we really want to deal with this, one of the things that we will do is we will escape into depression. So depression in many ways is an avoidance strategy. So something bad happens, we feel dysphoria, and rather than dealing then with what's going on, we get into this cycle of depression. So we have problems with sleep, we have problems with eating, we have problems with memory, we have problems with concentration, we have problems with our sex drive. We might have thoughts of taking our life. We might gain weight, we might lose weight. So we begin to have this cycle of depression. And if we're not listening to those red flags, now maybe we're listening to those red flags and we're saying, wait a minute, what's going on here? I'm depressed, I better deal with this. And then we might use some of those principles of ACT therapy, stop struggling with our depression, and maybe get some guidance or some coaching through the workbook or with our psychiatrist or psychologist or psychotherapist or social worker or friend or mentor. And we begin to use those principles of what are my values and what can I do then to get my life back. But if we don't and we struggle with our depression, then what we find is we start to become depressed about being depressed. And then we cycle through that. We're depressed about being depressed. And then what we find is we get further into the trap. And we start to get anxious about being depressed about being depressed. And now we're further into this trap of depression. And then pretty soon we're into the next cycle where we're anxious about being depressed about being depressed. So this downward cycle, which is this trap that we can find ourselves in. So what is the way out? And so in today's presentation, Dr. Pavlatos will be talking with us about how we can view depression in a different way. What are some of the myths about depression? Some things that we might have thought were actually truths about depression turn out to be stories or myths about depression. And then Dr. Pavlatos today will talk with us about applying some of the key principles of acceptance and commitment therapy to help us deal with our depression and get back to having a life. And that's the key thing that we want to talk about in all of our classes, is having a life, being alive and having a life. So Dr. Pavlatos now will talk with you about some really key principles in healthy and effective ways to deal with depression.
So, one of the things that I want to start with, as far as myths about depression go, I think the number one myth about depression is that it's abnormal, okay? Because we look at, mental illness like it's this label that automatically puts us into a category of people with mental illness or people without mental illness. So I wanted to take a few minutes to just talk about briefly some statistics about, mental illness and where these definitions even come from and what are the purpose of these definitions, okay? So if we look at illnesses like OCD, pretty rare, right? Like maybe 1 to 2% of the population has obsessive compulsive disorder. If we look at, PTSD, after someone's been exposed to a trauma, about 20% of people who've been exposed to a trauma, which isn't everybody, it's a small group, 80% of people won't get PTSD, 20% of people will, okay? Major depressive disorder, about 20% of the population at one point or another in their life will meet criteria for major depressive disorder. So 80%, pretty big group of people that won't. But when we clump all of these things in there together, add in social anxiety, add in adjustment disorder, add in bipolar, schizophrenia, put all of these diagnoses together, and over someone's lifespan, 50% of people are going to fall into a category of meeting criteria for some kind of emotional, disorder, as we're going to put it. And I say disorder because I want to take a second to talk about how we come up with the word disorder as well. But 50%, it's like flipping a coin. If we were to sit out there on a park bench, and just watch people go by, one person maybe would meet criteria and the next person wouldn't, right? If we're looking at siblings, a brother and sister, one, might meet criteria, the other wouldn't. Spouse, one might meet criteria, another wouldn't. We could just do this all day, right? And kind of watch people walk by, one, two, who's meeting that criteria for a mental illness during their lifespan, or who will and who isn't. So 50% to me seems kind of like it's a normal thing, right? I mean, if we think about other things that are like, 50%, it's the flip of a coin. Whether, me or Tom or Scott or you or who is it going to be? Or is it going to be all of us, right? At some point, someone we know or a lot of people we know or half of the people we know are going to meet criteria for an emotional disorder. So to me, that sounds more like we're kind of labeling some things that are part of the normal human experience, okay? So why are we labeling things that are part of a normal human experience as mental disorder? And there's some really good reasons. Sometimes we want to do research. We want to see if this treatment's going to work, if that treatment's going to work. So we need to come up with criteria so we can do research. For certain things where medications are a great fix, like if somebody's really, really manic, medications are a great fix. If someone's hearing voices, medications are a great fix for that. We can address that. We're not going to fix everything with it, but we can do some things with medication. And so it's useful to be able to say this med will work for this category of symptoms, okay? But these are not disorders that are figured out with a blood test. I can't scan someone's head and say, oh, definitively you meet criteria for major depressive disorder. I can see right here on your brain that this part, we can't see that. So these are really symptoms that people get together, literally, and vote on. So we have a group called the American Psychiatric Association. It's a group of psychiatrists. Any psychiatrist can join it. But they have committees of people that meet, and they go through the research, and they try to come up with the most useful groups of symptoms and syndromes, and they vote. So we have a group of, granted, I'm going to say, really competent, really smart people, but still a group of people that are getting in a room and voting on whether or not, that symptom is something that we're going to use to meet your criteria for a mental illness, okay? So when we're talking about that in terms of suffering, if you meet 5 criteria for major depressive disorder, well, you have major depressive disorder. But what if you only meet 4 criteria? What if you have thoughts of death? What if you have low energy? What if You know, you have anhedonia, which means like you just feel like you don't want to do things or you can't enjoy things that you would normally enjoy. But you don't meet the other criteria. Maybe your concentration's okay. Maybe your weight has stayed the same. Maybe your sleep is okay. Does that mean that you're not suffering? Right? So I'm not sure that the DSM, which is what we call our manual of mental disorders, is really the way that we, you know, can really gauge human suffering most effectively. You know, and human suffering is going to happen all the time, right? If somebody loses a child, it's going to be devastating for people. Of course, they're going to be sad. They're not going to want to get out of bed. They're not going to have energy. They're going to feel like their whole world has come to a crumbling halt. And of course they would, right? And would we take that away from them? Right? I mean, what would happen if someone walks into an office, or a friend of yours comes in and they say, well, you know, my kid died, but I'm doing great. I'm going out this weekend and everything is fantastic. Wouldn't we worry about that person? That would be abnormal, right? So part of the myth about depression is that we need to be happy all the time. That like happiness is something that we should have, you know what, like 80% of the day, 50% of the day, 60% of the day. You know, I mean, think about even happy events and how they kind of happen in your life, right? Because even happy events are a little bit of a mixed bag. You might go to a kid's wedding and you're so excited for them and you're worried, is everything going to work out? Are they going to, you know, is the marriage going to work out? Are they going to end up divorced? My babies are leaving me, you know, so you have some sadness there. So yeah, we feel happy, but typically we don't just feel happy, or we don't feel happy all the time. We actually have a word for happy all the time. It's called mania. People can't function happy all the time, right? Because they can't, you know, kind of deal with life because they're, you know, either chasing being happy all the time or so happy that they're not attending to the things that they need to do. So that's myth number one, is that happiness is sort of the thing that we should be. So, here's my notes. So myth number two of depression is that it's an inevitable response to stress, right? If we're looking at data, we can see that most people who have depression have a lot of stressful events in their life, okay? And that makes perfect sense, right? Makes perfect sense. But if we look at a lot of other people's lives, we see that a lot of people who don't have depression have a lot of stress in their lives. A lot of people who are depressed have stress in their lives, and they've had periods of time with stress in their life when they were not depressed, okay? So stress is something that we all have. If we're breathing, you know, if we're leaving our homes and getting out in the world, we have some kind of stress, you know. But one of the things that we know from data is that the way people respond to stress really tells us more about whether or not they're going to get depressed than whether or not the stress is there, okay? And people respond differently to all different kinds of stress. We have some people who are EMTs that can walk in on a gruesome scene, and that doesn't faze them. That's not the thing. That's the straw that broke the camel's back for that person. You know, but they might have a whole bunch of sleep deprivation where they've got to work long hours, and that might be the thing, right? Whereas for some person, that's fine. But then they see something really tragic, and that's the straw that breaks the camel's back in that case. So it's not necessarily the stressor. It's what do we do with the stressor? How are we responding to the stressor? How many stressors over what period of time? And how are we managing that? And we're going to talk about this a little more next week, but the other part of that is how are we incorporating that into the story of our lives? You know, a lot of people may start out and have a really rough start. I'm a foster parent. I see a lot of foster kids, right? Think about how the story comes with the foster kids. They come with their stories like on paper. Like, here's the story of this kid, right? So they didn't have a lot of, you know, sort of really great happy moments. So are we going to write in that story, well, this stressor happened, and then this stressor happened, and then this stressor happened, and therefore, there goes my life, right? And therefore, I am depressed. And therefore, until I can come to closure on this, I will be depressed, right? You know, it feels like that sometimes. It feels like the stressor is so overwhelming, and it may be something that we need to find a way to deal with. But stress, you know, being the thing that causes depression, it just doesn't add up in the data. It's not what we see. Okay, we see it's how we cope with it, how we respond to it, what we do in the face of it, and how do we have our lives still be meaningful even when those stressors are there, okay? So, myth number 3 about depression. It's about emotions, okay? So a lot of times we think about depression means I'm feeling depressed, I'm feeling sad. And so therefore, I need to stop feeling sad and start feeling happy. So it's just about an emotional shift. I'm going to go from this emotional state to that emotional state, right? When we look at sort of the behaviors of people who are depressed, we see that it's not actually behaviors that are consistent with grief all the time, right? We see people who are grieving and they're sad and they may be crying and, you might see it, feel it in the room when you're talking to someone who's grieving. But a lot of people who are depressed, they can't feel anything anymore. So a lot of depression is really not about feeling something you don't want to feel. It's about not feeling. It's about not accessing feeling anymore. Sometimes it's about avoiding feelings, avoiding strong feelings. That might feel like work. I'm not going to do that. I'm going to stay home. I would love to go do this thing, but what's the point? It doesn't feel like it used to feel. I'm not going to feel anything anyway, so I'm just going to stay home, right? So depression is really kind of a set of behaviors. We can see it. People stop doing the things that are important to them, okay? People stop engaging in the things that they used to engage in. They stop engaging in relationships that they used to engage in. And it's hard because people don't necessarily feel it the way that they used to feel it. They might used to, if you like roller skating and you go to Roller Kingdom, right? You used to maybe feel great. But when somebody's depressed, it doesn't feel so good anymore. So why bother doing it, right? And so then what happens is people start to withdraw more and more and more because why bother? It's too much work to go there and have to deal with not feeling anything. Then I'm thinking about how I'm not feeling anything. Then I'm starting to get anxious about the fact that I can't feel anything. And I feel like I should feel something. Okay? And so you get into the rumination cycle that you guys talked about last week, right? So what's the antidote to that piece of it? So the antidote isn't chasing happiness, right? I think I said last time I can make anybody not anxious, right? And give you a pill. You won't be anxious. You might not be conscious, but you won't be anxious anymore, right? As some of you who are here might remember. Same with happy, right? We can get happy. We can get high and get happy, right? That can happen. How long does that last? So if we're just chasing an emotional state, any one of us can do that. It's not effective, and it's not bringing us closer to a really valued, vibrant life that we want. It's not necessarily giving us relationships that we want. It's not letting us connect with our kids or our brothers or our sisters or our spouses or our parents, right? You can do that without feeling happy. Heck, you can even do it kind of without feeling too much. We can look at the behaviors that would be involved with that and do that and say, well, I wasn't really feeling what I wanted to feel, but I did it. And that was probably still meaningful to the brother or the sister or the kid or the parent or the spouse, right? But a lot of people who've been depressed for a long time, the story of kind of all of their stressors becomes huge. Right? One of the things that we see when people are depressed is that the way they report their memories actually gets a little bit warped. It gets a little bit warped. So people pay more focus to their negative memories and to negative experiences. Those become huge. So all these positive things that may or may not have happened, but may have happened, become less important when somebody's depressed. And so we see people reporting, this thing happened to me, and, maybe it turns from, I had this traumatic experience in my childhood and all of this other stuff to, my childhood was traumatic, period. So we see that with these negative memories kind of there, it changes the whole sort of way that we look at life. And so people don't want to add any more negative stuff to the story that they already have. So how do you not add anything negative? Well, don't get out there. Don't get in a relationship. It might go bad, so okay. I'll just protect myself and stay here. Right? Or don't take a risk, or don't go back to school, or don't try that new job. Because any of those things could be another stressor. So if we buy back into that other myth, right, that stressors cause depression, well, then we're going to avoid those things, right? It's not going to make me happy anyway, so don't do it. right? And so then we stay home. And then, of course, like you guys talked about before, staying home and doing this is what ends up happening, okay? So our next myth, I think I want to make sure I'm not skipping any of them. So our next myth is that depression is biological. And I'm sure you guys have heard this. You might have even heard it from your doctor. So I'm not going to lie. There's probably a lot of us out there who are really, really pushing the myth that depression is a totally biological thing. And that's because we're biological beings. We went to medical school. I mean, part of what psychiatrists do is surgery and deliver babies and their internal medicine rotations, learn to intubate people. I mean, it's a medical, biological thing. We don't get this other stuff until much later. So psychiatrists get very excited when we can look at all the biological mechanisms involved. But everything we do is biological, right? Behavior is biological. We can study that. We know that behavior actually affects neurotransmitters in the brain. That if I stayed in this room for 2 months, if I didn't do anything, if Tom just shoved food in here a couple times a day so I could eat, right? Maybe I had a television set and I sat up with that. And I did that for a couple months. My actual brain chemistry is going to change. Okay? You can't stay in a little place like this and not get out there and have relationships and have life and not exercise and not do the things that are important to you and have your brain chemistry stay okay. Human beings are just not wired that way. That's just not how we're built. So when somebody's depressed, yeah, are there biological changes that we see in that? Absolutely. But the cool thing about it is we can change neurotransmitters just by behavior alone. And we have a lot of studies that show that this is absolutely the case. Okay? I mean, I think that's kind of neat because we have some control of what's actually going on up here and not just thoughts. I mean, we've seen what happens when we try to control our thoughts. Like, that is not the most effective way to go. But we do know that there are certain things that we can do, and if we're really focused on the biological component, which is stuff that we've been taught to, probably by the medical community. Serotonin, you've probably heard about that, norepinephrine. Sure, those things are affected in depression, but it's not necessarily the cause. Like, I have a serotonin deficiency, right? We don't have a blood test that measures your serotonin level that we use clinically, where we can say, oh, we're just going to give you a little bit of this, we'll replace it, you'll be A-okay, you'll be happy all the time, right? If we had that, I guess we'd all be sitting in here happy. I'm not there, right? So I think the interesting thing about it is that, medication has a place, but wow, isn't it fantastic that even without it, there's all these things that we can kind of do. And therapy, and actually just getting out into the world and doing things even when you're not feeling it, has been shown to make a difference in depression. So that brings me to the last myth, which is actually about medication. And that kind of goes hand in hand with the biological piece, right? Typically, if you have a biological illness, you need something biological, like a pill, to fix it. So we know that we can change our brain chemistry just with behaviors. But medication, it can help and it has a place. But our studies on antidepressants basically show that the utility of antidepressants, where antidepressants are useful, is in really, really, really severe depression. Okay? And so if somebody has really, really severe depression, to the point where they haven't been able to function for a very long time, maybe they had a suicide attempt or 3 suicide attempts, or maybe they're getting catatonic where they're not moving anymore, right? So sometimes people get so depressed, they'll stay in bed for days and days and days and won't even eat. So those folks, we're going to use antidepressants, okay? But mild depression, moderate depression, antidepressants aren't that great. The studies show that they barely pull ahead of placebo, or in some studies, don't pull ahead of placebo. So placebo is like a sugar pill. So we can give you a sugar pill, and we can give you an antidepressant. And if you're not that depressed, it's not going to make much of a difference. It's not going to make much of a difference. So for people who are more seriously depressed, what we find is that the combination of therapy, of behavioral activation, where you're getting out into the world, where you're doing things that are really important to you, where you're, even if you're not feeling it, the Nike therapy, you're kind of just doing it, then that can make an enormous difference. Mild to moderate depression, the med's really just not going to do much. It's really not going to do much. Sometimes we can do things like, okay, you're not sleeping. We can try to give you something, non-narcotic to try to help with your sleep, because that might at least help you do those other things that you need to do. But aside from that, the pills just aren't going to cut it. Depression with psychotic features. That's another place where pills are fantastic. That's if somebody gets so depressed they're hearing voices other people can't hear. So depressed that they're having problems organizing their thinking. That's the kind of depression that we want to treat with medication, okay? And then that other stuff too, that'll come in there. But for people who are just feeling disconnected from their life, right? How many people here have had a period where you felt really disconnected from your life? And I'm putting my hand up and I mean it. It's not like I'm out of that crew. Okay. So there's no pill to make you feel connected. Because that's like a behavior. That's something that you work at. That's something that every single day, you need to be making a commitment to how am I going to show up for my life today. It may not be comfortable. It may not be fun. It may be a lot of anxiety. You may just feel too tired to do it. But it makes a huge difference, because that's the treatment for depression. It's showing up and being present in your life. Okay? So I want to review the myths, because I went through them a little bit quickly. So myths again. Myth number 1 is that depression is abnormal. Right? Because we talked about up to 50% of people that we see are going to have some kind of emotional disorder that someone like me might write down and put and stamp in a chart and say, okay, here's where it is. That's a 50-50 chance. Right? So I'm going to not buy in to that myth today. That depression is an inevitable response to stress. Okay? We know that depression and stress are related, but how we manage stress, how we cope with stress, can we find some meaning in our stress? Can we find ways for the stress to maybe even change our lives? Hopefully at times for the better. That will determine how we do with stress more than the fact that it's actually there. Okay? So myth number 3 is that depression is about emotions. Okay, so feeling like you're sad and you need to transform that feelingness into happiness. That feeling into happiness is a myth, right? And what we see with depressed people is more lack of feeling, apathy, inability to connect, inability to feel anything, okay? Our next myth is that depression is biological, that it's all about the neurotransmitters. And while we know that, there's some truth to that, just living affects our neurotransmitters, and what we bring to our life and what we do with our life can change our neurotransmitters just as well as anything else. And the last myth is that medication is required to treat depression. Sometimes that's true. For really severe depression, severe cases of depression, we do need meds. But for most cases of depression, which are mild to moderate, therapy is the way to go. Showing up for your life is the way to go. So in this book, it's by Kirk Strassel that Tom uses here. He actually talks about depression as a behavior. And I kind of like the way that goes, because I think it gives us a little bit of empowerment to kind of claim little pieces of our life back. Depression isn't just something that happens to you, right? It's not something that you catch like Ebola virus, right? You can't just, it's not contagious. I can't give depression to Tom. He can't give depression to me. Washing my hands all day long isn't going to stop me from getting depressed. So, it's not something that you get in that way. But maintaining depression is really a behavior. And that doesn't mean it's easy. I don't want anyone to think that I mean like, oh, okay, no big deal. Just accept it and start doing stuff even if you don't feel like it. No problem, right? I mean, if it was no problem, if this was something easy that we were asking of anybody, y'all would have done it, right? We all would have done it. It's so hard to get up in the morning and show up for your life when you don't want to. It's so hard to get up in the morning and to show up for your life when you kind of have your mind up there telling you it's not worth it, it's not going to do anything anyway, you've tried this before, this hasn't worked out, just go back to bed, it's too dangerous, you're going to get anxious, you're going to fail at it, blah, 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 right? All the things that your mind is telling you day after day after day after day. Because that's what you kind of have to bring with you. And as soon as you try to get out there, you think that just gets quieter? It doesn't get quieter, right? It starts screaming, what were you thinking? Go back home. This was a bad idea. You shouldn't be going back to school. Who do you think you are? Blah, 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 blah. or you shouldn't be in this relationship. Don't you remember how you messed up the last one? Oh my gosh, run for the hills, blah, 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 right? And your mind gets louder and louder and louder because your mind doesn't want any more stress, because your mind is telling you, just like the drug company, they're telling you on commercials, and TV shows are telling you, and maybe even your doctor is telling you, depression, it's there. You need to manage your stress. Don't ask for any more stress. This is biological. You can't help it. You're depressed. Go home. Blah, 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 blah. Right? So the antidote sounds simple. Nike therapy, right? Just do it. Sounds simple. And I want to say about that, when we say just do it, it doesn't mean do it in a dishonest way. Because you can show up and you can fake it. And I'm not saying if faking it's the best you've got, fake it. That's better than not doing it. Faking it is great if your alternative is staying in bed. But I think there's sometimes a sense of, well, if I'm faking it, that means that I'm being dishonest. And people do that all the time, right? Remember the beach ball and trying to shove it down? And I think we talked about that a couple sessions back, and it's on your worksheet, right? Just trying to pretend and just shove everything underwater. Nike therapy and just doing it isn't about submerging all of your emotions and not ever letting them out. It's about showing up to your life and doing it with honesty, right? So can I do it and still feel all of this stuff? 100%. It doesn't get smaller when you get out there and do the things that are important to you. Those feelings that are uncomfortable get bigger. Your mind telling you all of the negative stuff gets louder, right? So it's not suppressing it. Can you show up to that relationship even when it feels like the stupidest thing in the world because you might get hurt again? Can you do that anyway? And watch your mind, and there it goes. Knew it was going to do that, and here I am, And oh my gosh, I'm feeling anxious about it. I knew that was going to happen. There it is. Can you hang in there? Even when your anxiety is up. And then your brain is telling you, all right, we'll give this maybe a week. We'll try this a couple times, and if it doesn't fix my depression, well, then forget it. Right? Brain is going to tell you that too. It doesn't work that way, because this is not a trick to get your depression gone. This is not a trick to make you feel happy all the time. If I just accept that I'm not happy all the time, I'll be happy all the time, right? It doesn't work that way. It means that we're still going to be sad, that we're still going to feel disconnected, we're still going to feel anxious. And can you show up for your life and acknowledge that and make room for that? Very honestly, right? And very genuinely, but still be there. And a huge part of that is figuring out what it means to show up for your life. Because if you've been really disconnected from yourself and from people around you for a long time, you might not even know anymore what showing up to your life means. I had someone say to me, I don't even know what I like. I haven't even considered what I like to do. It's been so long since I felt like I even kind of had that option that it was difficult to even write down a list of things that person was interested in, because they'd just been staying home for so long, or trying to please people for so long, or trying to fake it for so long, that it just seemed like a foreign concept, because that's the place to start. What does it mean to show up? And that's all about values, figuring out what's important to you. If the depression were gone, what would your life look like? If anxiety was gone, if you could just say, I'm going to get through my life without it, what would your relationships look like? What would your spiritual life look like? What would your family life look like? What would it look like if you were out somewhere in the world with your kids, or your brother, or your sister, or your spouse, or your parents? What would that look like? If someone was watching you, how would they know that you were doing something important to you? And those are hugely important questions, because that's what it's about. You have to have something to show up for. And if you don't know what that is, well, you can show up. You can show up to my life. You can show up to Tom's life, right? You can do what we tell you to do. We can say, go to the gym. The gym is great. But if that's not important to you, don't go to the gym. Find something else that's important to you. If I say, you know what, going back to school, that would be fantastic. That's great if that's my value. But it doesn't matter what showing up to my life would look like. So, that's the huge first part. What would it look like if you were really, genuinely, honestly doing the things that were important to you? And then how do you take really small steps to just start moving in that direction? And what's so cool about the mindfulness group for people who get a chance to go to that is that being present in the here and now really, really helps you show up. Because if you notice things as basic as your breath, if you can refocus on what your mind is doing when you're trying to breathe, right? Because your mind does a lot of things when you're trying to breathe. You're like, breathe in, breathe out. Okay, I got this. You know, a few minutes later, you're like, what am I going to eat for dinner? Okay, focus on my breath, right? And then you're worried about things that have happened in the past, and you forget about the breath, and then you come back to it, right? And then you start, you know, getting upset or anxious about something, and your mind goes again, call it back to the breath. That's a fantastic practice. Because think about how distracted you can be in a simple meditation. Like in 5-minute meditation, your brain can go a million places. That's why they sometimes call it the practice of 1,000 beginnings, because you're always starting over. You're always starting your concentration anew. But how much harder is that to do when you're actually in a high-stress situation, right? Maybe you have social anxiety and you have to show up for a parent-teacher conference at your kid's school, right? And how many times is your mind going to go off there? Like way more. And so if you have that mindfulness practice, then you get used to watching what your mind is doing and bringing it back to where you are. It's like, okay, thanks for that, and now I'm coming back here to what I was doing, right? So it gives you the practice of being able to just kind of observe what's happening. And then the ability to kind of stay present a little bit with the person that you're with. Because it's all great to be present with your breath. You know, it's nice. You feel kind of calm. But isn't it really cool to be present with your kid? Or to be present with the person that you love, you know? Or to be present if you're like hiking and you're on the top of Mount Rose and you get to like look around at the trees and like the view, you know? Or present, you know, if you're having a really good meal with someone that you really care about. Like that to me is, it's great to be present with my breath, but that's kind of what that's for. So when I'm present with those other things in my life, I can really be present. So I'm going to check my time. I think my half an hour is about up. Oh, I have a couple more minutes? Sure, I can take a couple more minutes. Awesome. Okay, so we talked about myths of depression, and we talked about Nike therapy and showing up for your life and doing it in a way that's really genuine and honest, which means bringing kind of all of that stuff with you. So I'm going to take just a few minutes to think about for next week, because I'm going to be here next week too, and we're going to talk about our stories next week. And so this week, when you're not here, take a minute to think about what your story is. You know, like, I'm a person who blah, 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 blah. I am a person who is honest. I am a person who is neurotic. I am a person who talks too much. You know, I am a person who at age 10, you know, did this and I had a lot of enthusiasm, but then this happened and my whole life changed for the worst. You know, if you had to come in and you just had 20 minutes to tell somebody your story, what would you say about yourself? I want you to just start thinking about that, because we're going to talk about stories a little bit more. I don't want you to do anything but just kind of put it together, okay? What's happened in your life? How did you respond to it? What did it mean to you that you responded to it that way? You know, traits, values, all of that kind of stuff. Just wrap it in there, and keep that in mind for next week. So when we talk about stories, you'll have that to kind of come back to next week.